seminal. It's not a word that we like to use very much in the world of history. If you bandy the term around too often, it smacks of sycophantism and a suspension of judgment. But every so often, maybe once or twice in a generation, a piece of work comes along that you can look at and think, this is going to be a book that endures, one that people are going to reflect on and change their perspective when reading and writing about the period in the generations that follow. In 2020, just such a book emerged. Its title was as modest as its author. It didn't profess to be the only title you ever need to read about the Napoleonic era, nor did it make false claims to an irrefutable truth. What it did do was set a fresh agenda, broaden the scope of how the Napoleonic era is perceived, and subtly make the case to think far beyond the typical Eurocentricism that has dominated the field of Napoleonic history, to set the period in a more holistic context. That title, The Napoleonic Wars, a Global History. Tonight, Alex Mikaberidze makes a welcome return to the show as we hurl the script out of the window for the second of our In Conversation interviews. We'll talk about something Napoleonic. That's pretty much the extent of the brief with these, but buckle up because interesting thoughts and a lot of laughter are unquestionably incoming. This is In Conversation with Alex Mikaberidze. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where for neither the first nor the last time, our guests' ears are burning. We are here for the second of our In Conversation episodes, designed much more like an informal chat down the pub, but with the mic on the table. There is no script, no prepared questions, and no agenda other than the fact that we'll be talking about Napoleonic history. And if you're going to do that without Alex Mikaberidze present, then I'm pretty sure a fairy dies somewhere. Probably. Alex, if you don't know already, is Professor of History at Louisiana State University, Shreveport, is the Ruth Herring Noel Endowed Chair, I always get tripped up by that one, for the James Smith Noel Collection, and is the author of The Napoleonic Wars, A Global History, and Kutuzov, A Life in War and Peace. Alex, welcome back. Are you feeling suitably embarrassed after that intro?
More speechless, yeah. I don't know what to say, Zach. Every time you get me. I am extremely grateful to you and Liam for inviting me back, for being so kind and overly generous. I have to say, overly generous with your introduction.
Like I say, modest in the title, modest is the author. Our esteemed quartermaster, Mr. Liam Telfer Esquire of that Emporium Telfer White and Sons, that is fundamentally the Napoleonic Wars pod tat shop / merch shop. Tat Master General is in the house. Good evening, buddy. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well. I'm very excited to, as you said in the sexy intro, shoot the fat with someone that's really sort of changed the game for our period.
I mean, we did kind of have a conversation by text yesterday about just how far we might end up fanboying our way through this episode. I mean, for me, that's like an esteemed practice on this show. For you, this is perhaps slightly newer territory. But I don't think we're going to be sitting here and telling Alex that he's just wrong over the course of this. Like, we might debate, like, find a nuanced points. Like, that's the fun of these episodes. But like, I don't think either of us are going to be turning around going, who is this idiot Alex Mikaberidze? I'm not sure anyone's at that stage.
No, I think if we did that, we'd end up just getting sucked into like the Napoleonic history vortex.
Yes.
Like you said, a fairy would die and there'd just be, black screens everywhere.
We'd probably get taken off the air.
Mm.
You guys are fun to be here, so I'm just enjoying. I appreciate it. And I'm learning some new, I guess it's the slang expressions, shooting fat. That's a good one.
Is that an army phrase?
Chewing the fat?
Yeah, well, shooting the fat versus chewing the fat.
Yeah, I think it says shooting the fat or chewing
Yeah,
the
you
fat.
said shooting the fat.
Probably both.
Okay. That is a GIF. So there is a GIF for, but folks, if you don't know what GIF is, I'm sorry, but you're just going to have to Google it. But there is a GIF that we use consistently on this show when we're talking about doing an either or situation that is based around, I don't even know what film it comes from. It's from one of those Disney films where the two guys kind of look at each other and go, both, 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 both is good. And that is basically the modus operandi for this show. If we've got two options, we're doing both of them. Let's get down to business though, because I do want to talk about proper history related stuff in this, unusually. Um, and the most obvious place to start, perhaps even it's almost a banal question when talking to you, Alex, is the why in terms of why did it take until what was it 2020? So you'd have been researching this what 2018, 2017 perhaps, for that international perspective on the Napoleonic era to get the attention it deserves. Because on one level, sure, this makes a degree of sense. You focus on the personalities, you focus on Napoleon, it's called the Napoleonic era. There is that obvious kind of stepping stone element that can lead you towards that Eurocentrism. But we've been doing that for 200 years, for heaven's sake. Like the guy's been dead a long time by now. And it's taken a heck of a while for people to start to actually think in those more global terms. So why do you feel that it took so long?
It's, I think, just a natural progression of things. And you're right that we've been, and by we, I'm saying, kind of meaning historians, have been at it for the 200 years. But if we really scratch the surface of the statement, then the time frame is much smaller. So you'll just reduce it to doing kind of breaking away from a national history, focusing more on the big themes and kind of moving into, especially when it comes to military history and into what we call new military history, then that's all just last 30, 40 years, really. Until now, until then, much of what has been written about Napoleon is falling actually within the kind of the scope of a traditional history. And traditional history has its own strength and weaknesses. Strength in that a lot of the books published in the late 19th, early kind of first half of 20th century are very substantive. I still read a lot of that material because it's remarkable to the degree to which they were willing to explore. Let's say if you read Albert Sabul's multi-volumes, his story of the revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, you'll be struck by um, the the really the granularity of it, right? I mean, he goes into details of specific issues that Napoleon grappled with, but it's focused on kind of within the French experience. And same can be said about much of the British history of this period, right? It's very granular, but focused on particular specifics of the British experience. Same thing for the Russians. Russians, for example, were willing to publish 22 volumes of kind of detailed examination of Napoleon's invasion of Russia. That's, just one, not even a full year, it's 6 months, right? So in many respects, we needed that kind of foundation to build upon and at a certain point to reach the conclusion that, all right, can we kind of stand on top of this pile of books and look beyond it, like that famous standing on the shoulder of the giants, right? Part of it is the change in the general kind of sense of what history is about. And there again, I support some of the changes in the field of history that has taken place in the last 35, 40 years. Some of it has been, I think, taken to the extreme, and there needs to be a certain balancing act. But I think one of the interesting things is that we increasingly value history not because what it tells about political, diplomatic, or military side of it, but increasingly what it tells us about the cultural, social and economic side. And so we have, for example, 80s and 90s, we have really great historians working on producing new understanding of what Napoleonic era or Revolutionary era was about from a different angle. And I think it's a culmination of it that again, you add another pile of books on top of it. And then for a historian from a new generation like me, who've kind of stands on top of all this remarkable mountain of research, then the desire is to look even beyond that, right? So another way to look at it is that doing a global history is a challenging thing, and what I mean by that is it requires you to study, to understand, to get a sense of multiple historiographies. And that's a tedious job because you need to read not just in English, but let's say in French, in Italian, in Spanish, in Russian, in whatever languages you want to kind of bring the perspective. And frankly, that was one of the kind of surprising things for me when I got involved in the Napoleonic field is that linguistic proficiency is lacking for many historians. It's just the reality of life in many respects. So I was fortunate that my family, my background, maybe my educational experiences all favored developing of multiple kind of linguistic skills, and then it's the matter of being willing to put them to use, right? Now you were saying researching in 2018. I got the contract for this book in 2009, and I promised them to give the book in deliver book in 2 years. So by 2011, it was supposed to come out, and then 2011 came and we blew by it, and then 2012 and 15 and 16. It was only in 2018 that I delivered the first draft. So it took me a long time. And every year I would write an email to the editor saying, listen, this is the challenge I'm facing. Give me more time. Which is again another issue that I want to kind of bring into to answer your question. And that is the willingness of the publisher to give you space. One of the challenges we face as historians is, of course, finding a venue to publicize our ideas. We might have great ideas, and I'm sure there were other people who wanted to do it. They just didn't have the opportunity to get in touch with a publisher who is willing to give them that, let's say, decade. That's a long time for a publisher to simply let the historian run with the idea. And so that's where I kind of now look back to my original statement is just being in the right place and meeting right people. I was lucky to been at the moment when there was a gap. I was lucky that I met people who were willing to share research with me. I was lucky that I met with a publisher, an editor who understood and kind of valued the idea enough to give me 11 years to develop it.
I mean, 11 years is like, I now feel less bad about the fact that my Siege Warfare edited collection for Hellion is something like 2 years behind. So thank you for that. That makes me feel better about myself. But embarking on a project that ends up lasting 11 years is impressive in its own right because of the level of attention that you have to sustain. Even within the course of a doctorate, by the end of, I mean, it took me 4.5 years to finish my PhD thesis. And by the end of it, I was reading some of the stuff that I wrote early on, kind of thinking, I don't remember the fact that I knew all of this. So how do you kind of maintain that? What's the word I'm looking for? That focus doesn't kind of really do it justice, but that you've got to juggle a lot of things because if you are doing a global history, you need to not only be able to talk about different spheres at varying, all in kind of simultaneous points in time, but you've also got to stay up to date with the new research that comes out, which then elongates the problem even further. So how do you go about that challenge? Because you've got to have a certain mindset, and it's not a mindset that I can get a window into.
That's a great question, Zach. And I think there are different ways you can grapple with, and I'll just share my own experience and let the listeners decide if that's what if that's what they want to do. Um, I don't know if it's my background, if it's my kind of makeup or character or temperament, but I'm very disciplined person. So I have a plan. I usually have and that's I'm saying I had this kind of approach since really high school. So I would have a reading agenda for every week. So I would say, all right, this is the things I want to read, and this is the pace I'm going to be reading at. I have a separate kind of thing. This is how much I'm going to write every day or every week, and I have to stick by it. And so in terms of reading, I still do. I mean, I have piles and piles of books, and literally, I'm probably reading, at least 70, 80 volumes a year. Some of it for review, probably a little portion of it, but most of it is because I want to stay up to date. So that means reading kind of every week. There's at least number of volumes. My wife always teases me, but also kind of has a point that my bedstand by my bed has a pile of at least 15 books, and she always jokes that the pile grows, and one day I'll die by, when it topples over and she wakes up and I'm covered by these massive volumes. Um, but I think for me, that's the only way to stay up to date. And so that's, well, one of the ways. Another way is that I read a lot so I'm subscribed to a lot of journals. So that includes some pop kind of more general journals, like, for example, the London supplement, right, the Times Review supplement, or the New York Review of Books. One of my favorite is Literary Review. And so I constantly kind of peruse what is being published and then read the review, see if it's something I'm interested in, and then getting books. But again, see, I'm a lucky guy in that I am at a university that has resources to support this kind of, um, I guess, hobby. I don't know, because I can buy hundreds of books every year because I have an endowed professorship, and that's it's a luxury that I know not many people can afford. So the answer to your question is partly having a structure and a plan, but partly having resources to do it.
I'd love to, if I may, Alex, sort of talk about some of that research and how it sort of related to each other. Because you talk about, you're standing on the shoulders of giants, as it were, and I sort of have this image in my head, and you've got all of these different national narratives that you're then trying to create, or not necessarily create, but interpret the global context from all of those. You're standing on the pile of Russian work, French work, American work, your work on things like the Ottomans and what was happening in Arabia, I think was really interesting to me because it's sort of outside of my usual sphere. How did you go about sort of threading that all together to create the global perspective? Because I think it would be quite easy just to be like, well, this is, you almost end up just regurgitating, each national narrative, as it were. How did you create the global perspective?
I think the word create is actually an appropriate one because, again, my argument consistently is that history is a subjective experience. And I know, for example, if you decide to write a book like this, your focus, your interpretation, your emphasis will be different from mine, and same applies for Zach. So this book is a work of creativity in that way. Um, so you would notice, for example, that the book kind of has, it focuses on particular experiences over others, and that's, again, it's a subjective kind of the harsh reality. In fact, to go back to what Zach was asking, the publisher gave me 120,000 words to write this book. Halfway through it, I went back and I said, I cannot do it 120. I can maybe do it 250,000 words. And then ultimately, I delivered well over 350,000. And so we kind of bantered back and forth. And this is where the work with an editors and working with a top editor really is such a privilege because what I delivered focused on the experiences of the multiple nations, I would say, well beyond the great powers. For example, I had a separate kind of thread on Georgian experiences. I had a separate thread on the experiences, let's say, of North Africa, for example. Not to mention a more substantive, a longer discussion of situation in Latin America. But ultimately, when what I thought that all of this were important, but then once you get a fresh set of eyes, and especially editorial eyes, and they will say, "Listen, yes, it's Georgian thread is cute, but what does it add to a larger picture, right?" So then you have, and this is a really, I cannot emphasize how privileged you are when you are working with somebody who is knowledgeable, who understands this process, and you have a constructive kind of process of creativity in many respects, because I would send him a chapter or send him a part. Usually I send him um, several kind of chapters that would constitute a part. And he would read it, send me substantive criticism, and I will just sit down and really think, are the choices that I'm making, are they reflective of my own interests, or are they reflective of what the field needs, kind of what's the crucial narrative is. And so ultimately you kind of work towards the work of thesis. Now, I do want to step back to what Liam you were asking in the beginning is that and it's in a way to answer Zach's earlier question, is that in order to do a global history, I do feel that you need to have a good understanding of the foundational kind of basics, the granules that ultimately create. And when I kind of teach students methods, research and methods, I tell them that I borrow actually a French historian's quip that there are two types of historians. One that are like truffle hunters going through the forest in search of truffles, kind of nose to the ground, looking for specific things, right? And then you have also a paraglider who, at the same time, kind of hovers around above the forest and sees. But in order to understand what the forest is about, you have to have experience of that truffle hunting, right? And so before I got to the global history, my early publications are all about those granules, kind of specific events of history. Let's say 3 volumes on Napoleon's invasion of Russia. So in order to write that, you need to have a better kind of grasp. Why did these countries go to war? What are the French national perspective? What is the Russian national perspective? And of course, the war begins in June of 1812, but the reality is that these countries have been at war for about, at conflict for a better part of a decade. And so what happens then is that by the time you get to the global history, right, by the time you get in a paraglide and kind of hover, you already know that these parts of the forest already make sense to you. You know them very well. So now the question is how the other parts of the forest fit right together. So and that's why I think one of the challenges, again, to go back of doing global history is that if you want to do it well, you have to be willing to both be in the paraglide and kind of look at the big picture, but then go down into the kind of weeds and kind of do some bushwhacking and get a better sense of the ground. And that's a lot of work, right? Would you want to devote, a decade of your life to a single publication without expecting or knowing if it does well, or would you want to produce two, three, four books at the same time, right? That will be more maybe manageable, more focused on particular event. And so again, that's another issue of it. Right now, for example, I'm writing for the same publisher for Oxford, a new history of Louisiana Purchase. And we are having the same problem there in that they wanted it to be they want it to be as part of they have a wonderful series called Pivotal Moments of American History, and they simply wanted to have a study of those essentially 15 months that led to this to the sale. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized, well, first of all, those 15 months have been done very well, right, by by other American historians, and some are good friends of mine. So I want something different. So something different will be an international perspective, or more crucially, putting those 15 months in the wider context of previous actually 250 years. Because if you do, then, or at least that's increasingly my conclusion, the way I look at it, and kind of, I spend about a third of the book now, and I haven't even gotten to the French Revolution. So you see where I'm heading. The editor will be really same editor, by the way. Well, he probably expects that say around what three now of dealing with a book that is extremely long. But what I'm essentially saying is that when I look at the long history, longue durée of the French experiences or Spanish experiences in North America, then it makes sense to me more what happens in those 15 months than simply to look at it and say, oh, Napoleon, he just decided to sell the territory. But that requires me so I spent the last 4 years now going through the French archives. Now I have switched to the Spanish and American archives. And so, deadlines have been blown away already twice.
Again, I'm ever so slightly reassured because I have had sort of ever so fleeting sniffs of conversations with some editors about thesis into book, and have sort of said, yeah, I'll get back to you when I've sort of got half the book written or whatever, and not got there. So the fact that actually I'm clearly not alone in taking much longer to get this thing squared away to a point where I'm content with it is mightily reassuring. I wasn't expecting this session to turn into therapy, but that's kind of what it's turned into. Um, I am going to take us in a very different direction at this point, though, and talk about a topic that has often fascinated me, but I've never. I mean, it's an ongoing conversation, so you will never have a definitive answer to this. You've looked at multiple nations as a part of this, quite obviously, and so within the discussion about nationalism and its emergence during this period, I think you've got a better perspective than a lot of folks who make, whether it's fleeting comments or more detailed comments about the development of nationalism during this period. It's very obviously, well, I mean, I say it's very obviously embryonic. I suppose that's part of my question. Would you agree necessarily that it is embryonic? My sense is that it is, and it's developing, but there's a kernel of something there that the Napoleonic Wars will be part of nurturing it and developing in terms of national identity and what it means to be British, French, Russian, Spanish, Portuguese, whatever it might be. That's not to say that the process is complete. The development of the Italian states is something that we talk about Napoleon being quite key in terms of creation of the Cisalpine Republic and so on. And so equally, the disbandment of the Holy Roman Empire, again, we attribute some of that to Napoleon. You've probably got a much better sense of this, not least because all of those examples that I've cited off the top of my head are Eurocentric, which immediately just reaffirms that kind of Eurocentric bias of where my brain automatically goes to. You've looked at Iran, amongst other things. So with that perspective, when people sort of start making comments about nationalism and sort of its rise during this period, where does your brain go with that?
Yeah, sure, same kind of examples as you cited, but more often than not, I look to Islamic world, to Latin America. This is where kind of I would look at, for example, one of my favorite topics to discuss is kind of emergence of the Argentinian identity. Of course, that is inherently connected to both Spanish Empire, but equally to the British efforts to open the Spanish imperial domain during Napoleonic Wars. So the two invasions, right, in 1806, 1807, or attempted invasions are catalysts for it. And you're right that it's not that Napoleonic Wars saw the birth of nationalism in its entirety at once. This is the beginning of a long process that has a lot of twists and turns, and certainly over the 19th century, these identities undergoing national identities undergo a process of formation. But Napoleonic Wars well, I would say more of a revolutionary era rather than Napoleonic Wars as such. Revolutionary era with its ideas, with its principles, with its violence. For me, is the place where it begins. You can always find little bit precursors here and there predating the French Revolution, but the narratives kind of come forth, create conditions during this period that put forth this national sense of identity. Maybe not nationalism as a full-scale political ideology, but certainly national identity. And that actually plays out in different ways. For example, we can talk about the War of 1812 being, United States, sometimes they refer to it as a second war of independence, which is a weird thing to say, considering that the United States seriously attempted to invade Canada, right? So it's uh, a war of independence where you're invading a neighboring territory. Um, but equally interesting for me is the process of kind of national formation for, let's say, in Eastern Europe, right? Because this is a period when, for example, Polish identity is being forged in in a modern fashion, and certainly in the conditions that are very, very tragic for Polish nation as a whole. So we talk about three Polish partitions, we talk about Russian takeover in 1815, and the rest of it, or let's say the 19th century of the shaping of the Polish identity is all about this experience that begins in many respects in the revolutionary era. Same can be said about my own, for example, homeland of Georgia. Georgia is being taken over by Russians in 1801, and the process of dealing with that, dealing with what Russian colonialism brings, what the Russian imperial means to the region as a whole, all that is really at the root of the emergence of the Georgian modern identity. In fact, that's one of the interesting thing is how history, kind of the use of history, or misuse of history, if you want. For example, we have, of course, ongoing political, I would say, revolution right now, right? As we speak, last night there was a mass demonstration against the government's decision to stop the European integration. And but on the sideline of it, the interesting thing is that the government, the Georgian government, is, for example, approved a new history program to curriculum for high schools. And in high schools, they removed every reference to anti-Russian demonstration or revolution or revolt that took place since the Russian annexation in the 19th century. So essentially, here we talk about the crafting of national identity, right? The process of kind of using history to craft it, but without the awkward angles, without the jagged angles. So how do you talk about this period without, let's say, of Georgian history, without mentioning that in 1802, the Georgian nobility was forced, that it was virtually at the point of a gun, to pledge allegiance to the Tsar? That several months later, you have already uprisings against Russian authority. You have an 1804 massive uprising, which was crushed by the Russians. Or then 1812, just as the Napoleon is invading Russia, that you have a massive uprising in Georgia. And all those references are removed from the historical discussion now, at least will be removed from historical discussion. And yet they are core at shaping what is the Georgian identity, because it is developing in response to the colonial rule of an empire. And that can be expanded to the other parts of the world and kind of discuss, you can see, let's say, Egyptian identity, modern identity emerging in a very different context because of the impact that Napoleon has on Egypt, creating this political vacuum, the rise of a more kind of modernized, more centralized state under Mehmed Ali, and how that impacts the sense of what is it to be an Egyptian.
I think you could. I think you mentioned it in the book as well. You talk about that influence in Germany with the Confederation of the Rhine, and I guess the question is: do you need conflict to create national identity? Can national identity come from a place of like a unifying factor other than conflict? Because we look at a lot of your examples of Georgia there. That there's huge trauma that is then created. Uh, People, it's made people look inwards or to their kin, and sort of come together against an external force like the Russians or like the French, for example, in parts of Europe. And I wonder if we can sort of. I'm sort of waffling a little bit, and I'm mulling this over in my head as I go. Can we sort of look at national identity coming from a more positive place, or does it always have to come in that storm of conflict?
Oh, I think to a degree, it can be and is done. It certainly was done in the 18th century, revolutionary era, and that is done through literature, through literary elites and their discussion of existence of a in many respects, a mythical nation or mythical ties, and that's especially evident in Germany, right? There is actually a new biography, a wonderful biography of the brother Grimms that came out, he published by Yale just recently. And it's of course Grimm brothers are a good example of this kind of desire to craft a common kind of German kind of sense of identity. That yes, you can be living in Munich or you can be in Hanover, but there are certain common threads, common ties that we all have. And of course, for them, it was the folk experience or the folk tales, and they went around and collected. And of course, remember, this is all done right in the smack of what kind of our period, right? But what my argument, however, is that um, literary, kind of philosophical or historical, all of these discussions only get us to a certain point, and of course, then they stop in many respects at the political boundaries. So, if without Napoleon, yes, Grimm's probably would have collected those stories anyways and published them, but would they have been able to erase a political entity that was comprised of over 300 elements? Probably not. That's where the violence is important. This is where the violence sweeps those political boundaries away and creates something new. In German case, we went from a Holy Roman Empire with hundreds of entities down to just 3 dozen, right? So that's one element. The second important element is that violence asks us to reevaluate what's important to us. And that's, again, Germans are a good example of it. A Prussian state would have evolved, certainly gradually would have gone through a period of reform and change, but it would not have evolved at the pace that it had to do in the wake of the calamity of 1806. There, the quote unquote national security needs are kind of bringing the impetus to overcome traditional resistance to some of the changes. So same applies to all, same thing would have applied to other countries, be it France or Britain or Spain or Austria, where again, think about the changes that war makes possible would have been much slow to be adopted in the peacetime. And this is where I looked at Napoleonic Wars as a catalyst, right? And in the book, I've argued that it is part of that great divergence, that the scale, the intensity, the duration of this conflict meant that European states had to change, had to reform in on a much faster pace, on a much kind of shorter timetable than many other parts of the world, and that gave them tremendous advantages in the post-Napoleonic period.
I'm going to risk talking about the N word here. Napoleon. I know it's a novel idea to talk about the guy who gives his name to the period. And no, folks, I'm not about to sort of dive into, what are your views on Napoleon? We have talked about him quite a bit in the past. There was a particularly brilliant installment about a year ago, in fact, where yourself and Beatrice sort of debated various facets of Napoleon's character. But we're talking about national identity, and uh, sometimes I get pushback on this take when it comes to Napoleon. But the Duchy of Warsaw, my view is that Napoleon views the political potential of creating the Duchy of Warsaw incredibly cynically, and that fundamentally the concept of Polish nationalism is a pawn that he utilizes for his own ends. And the almost unwavering loyalty that we see from Polish troops in the French army is something that he knows is there and can exploit, because fundamentally, if Poland is to have a place, or the Duchy of Warsaw, or something representing a Polish nation is to exist within Europe into the first half of the 19th century, that is going to require a Napoleonic settlement with a capital N, in the sense that it's got to come directly from whatever world Napoleon decides to carve out. Do you necessarily agree with that? Now, I ask that very mindful that I am not known for being generous to Napoleon on many aspects of his character. And I do see him as somebody who is deeply cynical and exploitative in many of his approaches, particularly to foreign policy. You have perhaps a better perspective on this as somebody who's looked at different nations and the differing perspectives, and you're perhaps better placed to sort of judge what the future could have looked like for the Polish nation. So what is your take on how Napoleon handles the prospect of the Duchy of Warsaw and the idea of Polish national identity?
That's a very, very interesting question, and rather complex with many kind of moving parts of it. I think just to remind the listener, right, at the simplest, we can define nationalism as a politics that seeks autonomy for a group of people, right, for a group of people that identify as a nation, and that this politics, this kind of set of ideas, claim that there is a distinct nation um, that whose interests, whose values, whose aspirations are embodied in certain ideals. And uh, and the construction of this nationalist kind of doctrine, or national doctrine, if you want, based whether on intellectual claim or shared sense of identity or whatever the organization, right? Oftentimes it's a transnational process, and I think Poland, in this sense, is a good example of it. And the reason being is that, remember, when Napoleon kind of comes to Poland in 1807, Poland doesn't exist, right? A state called kind of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth dies in 1795. And therefore, what he finds there is the idea of Poland, right? But an idea that needs to be carried out either by the locals or by the outside force, right? Napoleon, and you're right in this, is cynical in many respects about Poland, because on one hand, he does promise Poles that the idea that they have will be implemented. But on the other hand, if you look at his correspondence with the Russians, especially during the great negotiations over the future of Poland in 1809, 10, and 11, especially 10 and 11, when Russians are proposing draft treaties to ban the use of very terms, Poland, Polish, Pole. Well, in those, Napoleon resists that. And in fact, in one of the letters, he famously says that he doesn't understand why Russians are so adamant about erasing this identity when Napoleon doesn't intend to restore Poland. He says, in the quote, he doesn't want to be a Don Quixote of Poland, right? So yes, it's a cynical ploy in some respects. But I wouldn't go to the extent of questioning whether Napoleon never intended to do that. He certainly didn't intend it, let's say, in 1810, 11, 12. But who's there to say if he would not have restored Poland to full sovereignty in 10 years from then? So I think Napoleon is if I've learned anything after studying kind of him is that he's a very pragmatic man, and this is where I disagree with the historiography that portrays him as a he's a megalomaniac, as an emotionally kind of driven guy. No, if you read his letters, it becomes clear that he's a very cold calculator and of reasons of why and how. And Poland is one of them. He completely understands how important this idea is to the Polish elite, less to the Polish nation as such, because if we look at the general understanding of what Poland was or what Polish nationalism was, this is the project of the elites, of the educated, rather than the masses. For the masses, the bigger issue would have been the issue of serfdom. And Napoleon understands that, and he takes advantage of it, right? I think in terms of nationalist narrative, a similar kind of line can be applied to Italians, right? Again, if we look at Italian nationalism, like in Polish nationalist case, it's a project of the literate elites. It is not a project that an average kind of Gioacchino or whatever the equivalent of Italian is for William and Johnny really espoused, and especially not in southern Italy, where the rural population we know were engaged in that the most monstrous of wars, right? And so here as well, Napoleon dangles the prospect of reviving Italian unity to a degree, makes a step towards it, like he did with the Duchy of Warsaw, but then stops short. But I looked at him as a savvy political operator. It's callous, sure. It's cynical, sure. But why should we expect history to be cuddly and fuzzy and all about kind of doing the good thing, right?
If only it was. I think we probably none of us would be sat here. Um, I kind of want to look at that thread of nationalism, but take it away from Europe and look at it from a Far Eastern perspective, because we know you talk about it in the book about how insular countries like Japan and China were. What do we know about their own national identity at the time? Because I mean, Western intervention in those places was illegal, right? It's a bit of a broad brush and a bit of a hole in my own knowledge, but what do we know about the sort of national identity in countries like Japan during the period?
No, again, remember that nationalism is a very kind of modern, in a way, secular ideology that comes out of a very peculiar set of circumstances in Western Europe. And these circumstances are not necessarily present in other parts of the world. So again, if we traveled, let's say if we were the Dutch and settled, kind of came to Nagasaki sometime in 1790s or 18 teens or 20s, I don't think an average Japanese peasant would have had an understanding of the sense of belonging, because again, the sense of belonging and identity would have been local and regional at the most. The sense of national identity only comes later on, and it only comes because of introduction of these westernizing reforms. For example, after 1854, right, after opening the Japan, we see the Japanese, of course, great reforms of the Meiji era, and one of them is, of course, educational reform, creating a standardized kind of national system of education where you tell a new generation of people, by the way, you belong to something bigger than your village, bigger than your region. You belong to a nation. And then you essentially, as a government, tell what this nation is about. You craft the story of it by emphasizing specific elements. That is same in Iran. That is same in Georgia. It's same essentially everywhere. And that is nationalism goes hand in hand with the story of centralization and the state extension of its authority, because otherwise regionalism still has a very powerful roots. That's actually, if you traveled in Italy, you know that's still true. If you come to Georgia, you'll see that's still true. In fact, one of the first things, we often, when we introduce to each other, we're like, "Where are you from?" Right? And not in like, "Hey, Georgia." No, you're like, "Which region?" I know your last name. You belong to that region. And the same, whenever I dealt with Italians, there was always, especially, I'm a big fan. I'm a passionate fan of football, and since childhood, I'm a big Italian kind of football fan. And my choice is AC Milan, but my son roots for Napoli. But if you watch those games, AC Milan and Napoli game, this is a Italian regionalism, maybe at its best and at its worst at the same time, right? So here's and that's what I'm kind of saying is that there is a wonderful book by was it Graham, I think, about I think the discovery of France, and it's a story of really how the notion of France really comes into being. And one of the core elements in the story is, of course, the fact that revolution and then Napoleon creates a national educational system. And this is a national educational system that imposes, let's say, French identity on regions that previously did not feel as French. Let's say Brittany, let's say Languedoc in the south, Provence, or for the worst of the examples, maybe the Corsica, right? We know the problems of Corsican nationalism still survive. So this is where I see is that the beginning of this kind of process is in our period, but it will take a whole century for the state to develop the arsenal of tools, by which they will impose this national identity on the population. And education here is absolutely fundamental.
You could certainly say the same about Afghanistan. That was somewhere that really comes to mind when you talk about that regional identity being more important than the lines on a map, as it were. Um, and I just wonder who benefits most out of that in terms of, is it, you talk about, you could even talk about colonialism in that point with some of these places. And I guess the general point of a country being colonized is to benefit the metropole, whether it be Britain or France or somewhere like that. But from the peasant's point of view, do they benefit from that regional identity more than they do a national identity? If that makes sense.
I mean, I would, sorry to jump in there, Alex, but I would go even further than that. In some respect, it depends on where you're talking about. But when these European nations, for example, start literally carving up Africa with a ruler, look at a map of Africa, look at those straight lines. They have been drawn with a ruler. That's why they look linear straight. And that's because people have just gone, okay, we're going to have this bit as far as this particular parallel, and you're going to have that part there. And off the back of that, these have created states that have endeavored in some respects to adhere to European models initially in terms of um, European powers creating sort of quasi-governmental systems in order to implement regional control. And then these nations have sort of pushed for independence. And actually, for individuals, that that straight line, that ruler that you've drawn through the Sahara Desert or whatever it might be, is completely meaningless, particularly in those regions where you have a much more nomadic tradition, where people will rapidly and repeatedly over the course of a year travel from one region into another country and then back again, because those boundaries, those borders are fundamentally artificial constructs that we've just drawn in there. And culture bleeds. And that's a very waffly kind of comment that doesn't really go anywhere. But I would go even further than you're going with that, Liam, personally. But Alex, it's fundamentally a question for you.
No, no, I agree with that. I'm not as familiar, let's say, with the African experiences as, let's say, with Iran. And in many respects, Iran is a good example for it because Iran is a very diverse country. It is multi-ethnic, multi-religious. It still is, but certainly was at this in our period. And it's also a country where ostensibly you have an autocratic system, right? We have a Shah, but a system in which the Shah's authority is not necessarily strong in on the periphery in the regions because there is no bureaucracy, there is no imperial kind of bureaucracy in the classical sense of it, and the society is very tribal, right? And it stays so until first half of the 20th century, if not for the centralizing impetus of let's say of the people like Reza Pahlavi, right? The sense of of Iranian identity would have been very, very different. And I think one of the interesting things about Iran, for example, and again, it goes back to this, the importance of the state, of centralizing narrative of it, the educational system, is that in Iranian nationalism, there's always been the tension between the concepts of Iraniya, which is kind of being an Iranian based on a pre-Islamic Persian heritage, as opposed to Islamia, which means an identity that centers upon the country's kind of Shia Islamic heritage. Because I've met a lot of Iranians who are very, very proud of the pre-Islamic Iranian history and culture. But then you also have Iranians who, so let's say, supporters of the government of the current government that is very keen on focusing on Islamia and kind of talking about the pre-Islamic times of kind of ignorance and sin, right? So how do you reconcile this national identity? Which part is more important to you, right? And this is where again depends on what regime you have, kind of government you have, that focuses off, kind of puts a focus on particular side of this identity through educational means or through propaganda means, because all states are engaging in crafting an identity, and it's the priority of the state that then determines really how we go about it. Um, I think the same applies, for example, for United States. I think one of the interesting things that I follow is, and having lived here in 24 years, is the degree to which the struggle and almost kind of the word struggle is appropriate here. The struggle for the control of the history textbooks is evolving here, and that evolve, and especially textbooks for high school education, the K to 12, less so college, but certainly there. And you can see, for example, the great kind of clashes over interpretation of history and how that relates to national identity in places like Texas, right? Where you see the Texas school boards routinely kind of dealing with or trying to remove any references to slavery and referring to them as immigrant labor. And that's actual reference, right? Immigrant labor as a way of crafting a certain type of national identity in which, right, the black, kind of the dark sides of the pages of history are set aside, and you kind of talk about the United States as a shining city on a hill. So I think nationalism, in a way, to kind of to answer your question in many respects, is such a complex phenomena that its imposition on individual level, yours and mine, um, always raises an issues. I still, so to give you kind of my own kind of experience, I was born and raised in Kazakhstan, moved to Georgia when I was not even, kind of almost a teenager, spent a decade living there, then moved to Europe, studied there, then came to the United States and spent half of my life here. So when we talk about nationalism, what is nationalism to me, right? Well, I've come to from so many backgrounds, and I've went through so many nationalist kind of narratives that, in many respects, nationalism rings hollow to me because I was not kind of indoctrinated in one particular set of national identity, identity. I remember Soviet approach to it. I remember Georgian approach to it. I certainly would seen plenty of it in Europe and then here in the United States. So maybe that's one kind of I feel that I'm detached from it. I kind of try to always think that I'm standing aside from nationalist narratives and observe them from a distance.
Alex, it's been a fascinating conversation. I know we could roll for another 3 hours, quite frankly. And I'm also acutely aware that if we reran this conversation, we would probably go in an entirely different direction. And that's kind of the beauty, I think, of the In Conversation episodes, that we never really know where we're going to go and what we're going to end up talking about. It's been an absolute joy to talk to you. I particularly hearing what you're saying at the end there, I'm tempted to look at doing an episode on the sort of the sanitization of Napoleonic history. But that's just an idea that's embedded itself in my brainstem, and I'll have to.
No, actually, I have a list of things I want to work on down the road, and one of my ideas is a book, maybe a working title, the Napoleonic Black Legend, and kind of look at the all the sinister stuff, as opposed to the legend, right? Look at the other stuff and see how as much of it is, I wouldn't say swept under the rug, but certainly in the in the popular imagination, certainly it doesn't come to it. I actually had on Thursday, this past Thursday, Wednesday, because Wednesday was the last day of classes in Louisiana or for my university. And I have students gave me a few years back as a gift a Napoleon's cutout, a full size, and he stands in the corner of my office. And I was sitting kind of working there, and a student stopped by, and he saw Napoleon's cutout, and he says, "Hey, do you like Napoleon?" And like, well, that's a unusual kind of way to ask it. Depends on what you mean by like. I work about Napoleon, but not necessarily like him. And his response was, "I love Napoleon." So I'm like, all right, let's have a conversation. And we sat down and kind of started talking about it. And of course, everything that he knows about Napoleon is the regurgitation of Napoleonic legend. And that's when I was like, man, I should get I should get to writing that book.
So we can look forward to that in what, 2036?
Yeah, give or take.
And that'll be 400,000 words. And yeah, I want to read it already. Take my money. Alex, such a joy to talk to you once again. Folks, if you haven't already got your hands on the Napoleonic Wars, A Global History, and Kutuzov, A Life in War and Peace, please go to the Oxford University Press website, where you will find them for a very reasonable price. And as we've discussed, they are lengthy titles, so you are absolutely getting value for money. Alex, such a joy to talk to you. I know you're going to feature a great deal over the course of the coming weeks, not only in an episode relating to the Peninsular War, because the Peninsular War series is returning this Christmas, but also in the semi-finals for the Battle of the Marshalls.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Bernadotte has made it through to the semi. There you go. You're getting a reaction live on air, folks. But
Team Bernadotte, I'm gonna make it sure.
Well, you say that, but don't get too excited, because it's a tight race, and I'm not sure that Bernadotte is going to make it through to the final based on the competition.
Don't tell me it's rigged. Do you know the result?
I don't know the result. Do you know, I wanted to rig, I shouldn't confess this, but I wanted to rig the semi-finals so that we kind of had the people that everybody loves to hate in one semi-final and the people that everybody love in the other semi-final. But I was very fair, and I flipped a coin in order to determine who was going to be in which semi-final. But it's going to be a heated contest. That's all I will say at this stage. Alex,
all right, I look forward to it.
So good to see you. Thank you so much.
It was a joy, a treat, and I appreciate you inviting me back. Thank you.
Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. We will be back very soon. Merry Christmas, folks. If you'd like to spread the festive cheer this evening, you know what I'm about to say. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Normally, when you listen to these, please, you're likely to be on the commute, so can't act on them, especially if you're in the car, and then you perhaps promptly forget. But if you're tuning in over the break, there is a chance you could actually do it right now. It'll take you a few seconds, and if all of our listeners did it, we'd be one of the top-rated podcasts in Europe. If you've enjoyed the 80 episodes we've produced this year and the hundreds of hours of free entertainment we provide to you, this is your way of paying us back. Help us rebuild. Help us reach more people. Head to Apple Podcasts, leave a quick sentence and a 5-star score. I can't emphasize enough how much difference it makes to the algorithm. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people memberships to the Patreon perks we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, socials, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join this buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying such a richer offering. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some exciting documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-December 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Cotland, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, and Dan Friedman. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Woolcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff: Adam Coslin, the Marshals: Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars: Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.